Test, test. Hello? Okay, cool, I'm good. All right, I guess let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming to this. This is about integrating with JIRA. There you go. All right, my name is Will Weaver. I'm with Expedia Group. I've been there for about 9 years now. 5 of those years has been in developing ServiceNow. So we have a lot of the core ITSM apps and Service Catalog, and I also tend to do a lot of custom applications at Expedia. I actually started with no code development experience, and I think that just is a good example of how ServiceNow is so easy to use that even I was able to do it. I also have a little dog named Kuma, and he's up there as well. So yeah, Expedia Group, we're all about travel. I never really traveled much before I joined Expedia, but thankfully I've been able to get around a little bit now. Maybe some of you flew in here using Agencia. It's our business side of travel. But what you're really here for is the JIRA integration, so we'll just get on to that. So what I hope that you take away from all this is try to do something, start small, simple, and do something well and knock that out of the park before you try to get too crazy. The other thing is to do something extendable and maintainable. If you're able to, you might save yourself some time later. If you happen to attend my last year's presentation, that's kind of what it was about. And finally, sometimes you just need to burn it down and start fresh, and that can save you some time in the long run. So as far as our agenda today, we'll be going over kind of the story behind our original JIRA integration. This is actually the 2.0 version, but yet it's actually simpler than the original. Then of course I'll go into the new one since that's what's important here. I'll start kind of high level and then kind of dive into how we do the syncing between ServiceNow and JIRA. And I'll also have a few demos intermix. So a few notes before we start. I'm going to be, every now and then I'll say something about outbound or inbound updates. So something to keep in mind is I'm always referring to ServiceNow as a point of reference. So whenever I say outbound, that means ServiceNow is sending an update to some other integration. Whenever I say inbound, ServiceNow is receiving that update. And also, I'm going to try to do something a little different where I have a bit of an interactive demo where I'm going to be going into the records themselves live. So go ahead and think of some questions while I'm doing that demo. Think of it as part of the Q&A session. We might have to hurry along a little bit just because I have quite a bit of stuff, but yeah, feel free to ask questions when we get there. All right, so this is a little bit about our original JIRA integration. Now, to be honest, it was rather featured and had a lot of capability to handle a lot of different type of updates back and forth. It could create issues. It could close ServiceNow tasks after an issue was closed. But the reality is that it was a rather complicated integration. We also had to store a lot of information in ServiceNow to the point we were almost hosting an instance of JIRA in ServiceNow. And also, if you looked at each of the different tables that had that JIRA integration included, it was different for every single table, so there wasn't very much for standardization. And so I mentioned that we were storing a lot of those records, and that was for the purposes of performing that sync. So what we were doing back then was we were actually bringing in all JIRA issues that we had in our instance, which there's a lot, and we were actually syncing every 5 minutes. Now, to try and reduce bandwidth, we were only syncing anything that changed, but even if a JIRA issue was just viewed, it was considered changed, so that we were bringing in a lot of information. And finally, we were also even using email to handle communication back and forth between JIRA and ServiceNow, and we actually had a few cases of infinite loops happening, and this is why we have APIs to handle that communication instead of using email. So just to kind of summarize, why we went away from our original JIRA integration, it was very unfocused. We tried to do too much too quickly all at once. And it didn't really handle anything particularly well. It had a lot of features, but they were unreliable. The other was that of how convoluted that we had built it. There wasn't any standardization, so when it came to troubleshooting or maintaining it, it was a losing fight. And we even were using UI macros on our forms as a means to interact with that JIRA integration, but I don't know anyone here who likes jelly. And finally, we wanted to reduce the bandwidth that, that this was using, just because that JIRA integration, issue pull was just hammering our system, and JIRA, frankly. So in case that was too much, I summarized this into a TLDL, too long didn't listen, and I've also converted this to a bit of a meme format. So yeah, Ramirez or JIRA, do everything, and even divide by 0. And of course, that never ends up working. And yeah, I apologize, it's an older meme, but yeah, it works out. All right, so as far as what we decided to do for the new JIRA integration, these are the goals that I kind of set for myself when I started building this. So first and foremost is I wanted this to have a very focused design. I don't want to try and do everything like Ramirez. I wanted to just focus on one particular feature first, do that well, make sure it has a good infrastructure underneath it before I started expanding it. So the first thing I did was I tossed out the idea that I'm going to be able to create and close issues between ServiceNow and JIRA. I just wanted to start with sending and receiving updates through comments. And of course, I'm not going to use email to do that either. The other thing is I wanted to make sure that this is simpler in the sense that this is maintainable and we can troubleshoot it easily. So in that case, I wanted to make sure no matter where you're sending the update from, which table, I wanted it to be handled the same way. So I don't have to memorize incident does it this way, problem does it this way. It should all work the same way. And finally, I wanted to make sure that the bandwidth use was severely reduced. Initially, we did have plans to have a webhook enabled for JIRA to send us that information. That's not there yet. We need support from the JIRA devs for that. But for the meantime, I have a sync job similar to the other, but with much less bandwidth involved. And I still do need to store some issues locally, but we only want to store what's necessary. So what I ended up doing to accomplish all these goals, actually, sorry about that, that's the wrong one. All right, so you might be asking, why do we even store issues locally? One of those reasons is our infrastructure. So we have a firewall between ServiceNow and JIRA, with JIRA's internal application. I actually need to pass all that traffic through a mid-server, which of course introduces some volatility and some time it takes to perform those calls. So for efficiency's sake, I do store some information in ServiceNow, just to speed up those queries. We do have actually plans to deprecate the need for that mid-server, and I'm hoping we can get that done soon. So let's talk about how we establish links between ServiceNow and JIRA. So I mentioned before we had a UI macro. In this case, I decided to use a UI action. Much more simple, and also I don't have to use jelly, which is always fantastic. So what happens is on any task that you happen to be on, it's just a simple click and you enter the URL to the JIRA issue you'd like to sync to, and then that's when we'll create the local record in ServiceNow. We do an API call during that, and that's so that we can store all the information we need about that JIRA issue. And you can see from our diagram here that this is you, and we make that API call to JIRA. And we have a couple tables in here which we'll go into a little bit later. One that stores the JIRA issue, another that relates JIRA issues to tasks, and finally the tasks themselves. So now let's talk about how we receive updates in JIRA. So again, I'll start with kind of the high-level goals. 1, avoid a heavy footprint and heavy bandwidth. 2, I needed to deliver something that's centric to ServiceNow since the webhook was not going to be available right away. And 3, I wanted to make sure that this is ready so that once that JIRA webhook is available, we can just switch to that right away. So at the end, that meant that we have that daily sync job like I mentioned, but we only trigger it for those records which have a established link to an active task record. So that means if that task is closed, we don't perform that sync, and that saves us on some bandwidth. And then also I have just a simple property that once I flip it, the sync job will only sync those records which are not currently synced through the webhook. And so that will just allow us to turn that on right away once it's ready. So from this diagram, you can see that if the webhook was enabled, it'll hit an inbound API that I already have prepared. Otherwise, we do a API call from ServiceNow through the daily scheduled job and update to JIRA Issues records. From there, we'll know which task it's related to by the many record, and finally update the tasks as necessary. And the last one, cursor, there we go. All right, so now let's talk about outbound syncing. So unlike the previous integration, I wanted this to be scalable and maintainable. I also wanted it to be table agnostic, meaning it doesn't matter what table is sending JIRA the information, it should all work the same. The other thing is I wanted this to be data-driven, and that will allow us to be scalable so that all I need to do is create additional records and it'll start syncing right away. So what I did is I created a table called sync conditions. I started out with that being very generic. It's a simple table that has previous and current condition builder. You can assign a table. And then what I did is I actually extended that one for JIRA, and pretty soon after we built JIRA, we needed to integrate with Slack, so I extended that again for Slack, and we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. And each of those table extensions also has a script include, and each of those extends from the base script include that houses all of the common functionality. So here's a screenshot of what that sync condition looks like. You can see it's a pretty simple table. Tell it what table to look at, what conditions to send that information to JIRA, and what to send to JIRA. You can see at the very bottom the sync condition fields. So right now, our basic rule right now on task is just to send if the task record is active or is just now changing from active, and we just send comments and the state information. So with any of this kind of bilateral updating, there's always the potential for infinite loops. And I'm sure you're wondering, how do I account for that? And basically just to avoid this kind of situation, I'm going to send the update to JIRA. JIRA gets it. JIRA's sending it to ServiceNow, and then just spirals out of control. So what I did is I actually created a dedicated service account, and this is the sole account that handles the updates back and forth. So whenever a record in ServiceNow is updated, this is the one responsible to make that API call to JIRA. So as far as JIRA is aware, no matter who made that update in ServiceNow, it's a service account that's applying that over to JIRA. And the same way as far as how we receive inbound updates, the service account is responsible for updating the tasks. And because of that, I can filter out the updates that I don't want to resend, and I can even filter out comments made by the service account so that I don't just apply the same comment over and over into ServiceNow. And here's just kind of a visual representation of that. So you can see that whenever a user sends an update, the service account is responsible for that communication back and forth. Whereas if that service account is the one that made the update, I have logic in place to perform the stop action so that we don't have that infinite loop spinning up. So I prepared just a little demo video just to show you this integration in action, and I'll just kind of narrate over that. And hopefully it is playing. I don't know if it's playing. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so that was a JIRA issue, and so now we're on the incident. So I want to link to that JIRA issue. So what I've done is I've copied the URL, and I'm pasting that into this record once I've clicked that UI action. You can see that there's some options that you can set for how you want this link to be established, whether or not you want to receive inbound updates and send outbound updates. So once that's done, you can see that I have a little related list here that confirms that it is linked and that the link was successful. And now I want to make a comment in the incident just to send that over to JIRA to have it recorded in JIRA that we have this incident open for that. You can see I have a little bit of a theme in my presentation. So So once I've made that update, you can see that we're notified that the update was successful, and that's actually a clickable link. So now that we're back in the JIRA issue, you can see that comment has been applied there. So now what I'm going to be doing here is making a comment update on the JIRA issue. And had we had the API call or the webhook enabled, this would be instantaneous. Right now, it's just a daily sync. So in the background, I'm actually running the daily sync job. There it goes, okay. So now we're back on the incident, and we can scroll down to the activity log, and we can see that the record has received that update from JIRA. Since all we did was do comments, what I'll do next is I'll update the state, and you can see what that looks like in JIRA once I save this here. So again, you get that same pop-up saying that the JIRA has been updated. And then you can see that, yeah, there's a previous comment, and then there's a newest update where I've updated the state. And again, that's a clickable link back to the incident. So basically, in the ticket lifecycle, these updates will keep going back and forth so that the teams can be in sync as far as the progress. And then once the incident closes, that link is now severed so that you don't have to keep repulling that JIRA issue for when there's no need to update it. Oops, okay. And then so back to that outbound syncing about how I created that table where there's a base table and I've extended it once for JIRA and again for Slack. And so one of the reasons I did that is just to be able to quickly spin up these additional integrations where I'm sending information outbound. So again, it's using a lot of the same fields that JIRA relies on, but I can also create additional fields on the extended table that are specific for the handling for Slack. So one example is a field that tells it which channel you want to send that update to. We've also done some ACL adjustments on that table extension, and we're actually allowing users at Expedia, anyone, to create their own conditions so that they can receive updates in Slack as they wish. So here's a demo of that. So this is the sync condition for Slack. You can see it's still got the condition field. You still set the table, but then there's some additional fields there, like the URL for the Slack channel. And so, yeah, this is just a sample condition that I built for the purpose of this demo. So we're back at that same incident that we were before with JIRA, and here I'm making a change to the short description, which is one of the fields that is synced based on that rule definition. So I'll also make a change to the priority. And I already have it set to in progress. I'll just leave it there, and I'll click Save. So then that'll send an API call over to Slack to post the message into the channel, and here you see it there. So I just have a simple utility function that will do a glide record summary based on which fields you are caring about, and it just pops up into the specified channel. So if I wanted to change the information that it sends, it's pretty easy. And what I'll do is go down to the sync condition fields, and that list should look familiar as far as what you saw in that Slack window. And so it's as simple as clicking New and selecting the field and what order you wish to see it on. So I'm adding the Incident Manager field. I want it at pretty high at the top, so I'll set it to a low order and submit the update. So we're back at the incident, and I'm going to make another change to it by adding myself as the incident manager, and I'll go ahead and save. So with that one quick data change, you can see that the update that you receive in Slack has changed. And this same functionality is applicable to JIRA as well. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to build that extensible solution. You're just that much quicker to develop the current integrations and anything new. And that's the same thing. All right, so now we're kind of at the interactive demo segment. So what I'm going to be doing is going through the records and scripts at a high level. And again, this is kind of an extension of the Q&A section. So if people have questions as we go, I welcome them. Just raise your hand or whatever. That said, I do want to avoid rabbit holing, and this is not a code review. I get that maybe I did something that you guys don't like. But yeah, so I guess just keep it on topic as much as possible and try to get through everything that we have. All right, so what we're going to be doing is hopping into the tables that make up this JIRA integration. We'll go into the scripts next. So there are 4 of them. One that stores the issues that we receive from JIRA via the API. There's that many-to-many table, which is actually the records you create when you establish that link. The conditions that specify when you sync outbound to JIRA. And finally, I have a utility table, which I hadn't gone over yet, that stores information about what fields we have in JIRA and how we parse them. All right, so this is the JIRA issue table. So you can see that we store some JSON payloads, one for what we received prior and as well as what we've received most recently, and this just allows me to do some simple comparison. So if the state changed from new to in progress, I at least know that new was the previous state, and I can mention it changed from new to in progress. We can also see this, the synced field right here. So this is kind of a piece that I built that's in preparation for that webhook. So once I know that that issue is being synced by that webhook, I can flip the Boolean there. And that way my daily sync job will know to skip that. And that way I don't have to make unnecessary API calls over to JIRA. And where is my cursor? There it is. All right, so this is the many-to-many table that I mentioned, and this is what establishes a link between a task in ServiceNow and a JIRA issue. And there's also some configurability. So if I hop into this record, so again, this is where you saw I put the JIRA issue URL, and I can decide whether or not I want to receive updates from JIRA or not. And if I do, I can actually specify which fields I care about. So if I open this up, I have my selection of these 3 fields. Now again, I want to start simple, deal with fields that I know very well how to parse. But we also have a way to quickly allow new fields to be included here. And then finally, I have a simple Boolean that says, hey, maybe I only want to receive updates from JIRA. I don't need to send anything out, and I can just simply toggle that there. And I had that record open already. All right, so this is the table that does the syncing, the configuration for when you want to send information out to JIRA. So right now we only have 2 simple conditions, one for task, which actually will apply for anything extending off of task, and then a specific one for problem. So you might recall that the condition I displayed a screenshot of before only sends state and comments. But what I've done to configure this is that if we go into the problem condition, you can see that it syncs a couple additional fields. So the way this works is it will check to see which ones it meets the conditions for and aggregate the fields that it needs to send. So in the case of a problem record, sending an outbound update, it's going to send state and comments, which is defined by the default rule, as well as the close and it notes and the root cause. So it'll be 4 fields that we're syncing over to JIRA instead of just a standard 2. And finally, here is the, so I haven't really mentioned this yet, but this is the JIRA fields table. So we have a lot of custom fields in JIRA, and we need to know what type of field they are so I know how to parse that information. And so this is kind of the cheat sheet that allows my scripts to know how to do that. So you might notice that the ignore changes is set to false on only 3 fields. So if I wanted to enable additional fields to be allowed for that inbound update, again, it's data driven. Just flip the Boolean and then it becomes available to be selected for inbound syncing. And you'll probably notice that I have a type field that basically I've pulled that information from JIRA, and this is part of our API call daily sync job that looks for any new fields and what type of field they are, and I'll write it to this table. And that type field is what lets me determine how that data needs to be parsed when we receive it. All right, so now we're going to be going into some of the scripts. So the first will be the JIRA integration script include, and this is kind of the core script that handles everything about the JIRA integration. And then we'll go into the scripts that handle the outbound syncing of JIRA. And then finally, the business rules that kick off the script includes. All right, so I've put everything in Notepad++, just hopefully that makes it a little easier to read. So the first thing that I wanted to just showcase is this sync issue method. So what this is responsible for is actually pulling the issue from JIRA and establishing the link to the task that you specified. So more or less this is what is called when you click the link to establish a link between a ServiceNow task and JIRA. So the next I'll look at is this get JIRA issue. So this is the performing the API call. You can see that before I do that, I go ahead and check our local storage to see if we already have it, because that'll save me an API call if we already have that JIRA issue stored. But if not, we'll go ahead and make that API call. So here's the method that handles that, the REST call. So what I'm doing is I'm actually building an object here, and I pass that into a generic method that does the REST call for us. So this way, I don't have to write every single time, this is how I want to make the REST call. I just specify some options, and I pass it over to the utility function that handles the REST call. And that's our next function that we'll look at real quick. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this is, again, going back to that mid server, there's some volatility around that. And every now and then we'd get a malformed JSON payload, or maybe the mid server just went down for whatever reason. So I have this checking for, first and foremost, if that mid server is up. And I needed to do this for all the REST calls. So might as well just write it once rather than every single time I need to make a REST call. The next thing is, again, based on that volatility that we were having, I wanted some retry. So I have this set up right now, and it's all controlled by properties, a default of 3 attempts. So if, for whatever reason, we receive a malformed JSON, it's going to go ahead and try again. Usually by the second attempt, if not the first, it will be successful. But it is configurable as well, so if I have a particular REST call that is calling this method, I can specify in that options payload, maybe this one I don't need to retry and I just want to do a 1 attempt. Yep. So then, sorry, I should have rehearsed the cursor finding. Oh, there it is, okay. All right, so this is the Expedia sync script include. So this is the script include that basically serves its purpose for the base condition table. Basically, this is housing all of the utility functions that will be used for all the table extensions that we'll create for that sync condition table. So I have, for example, one that is meant to create a business rule. So in order for the script include to be called, there needs to be a business rule that tells it to perform the sync action. So if I create a sync condition, for example, for Slack, on a table where that business rule doesn't exist yet, this will create it dynamically right away in production just by someone entering that information. And then the main function here is a sync call. So this will check to make sure everything is good to go to perform the attempt at sync. And it will check to make sure that a sync action method is defined. Now this sync action is actually going to exist on the extended table. The base script include won't actually have this. So if somehow you call Expedia sync.sync, it's not going to actually do anything because there's no definition as far as how to sync to the target that you're going for. Another example is I have a global method that to determine hey, did my condition get met or not? It doesn't matter what table you're on, as long as if you just do a glide filter.check record, you can tell if those sync conditions were met or not. So then the next script include, yes? I'm sorry? Yes, these are script includes. So what we were just on prior was the script include that accounts for the base functionality of the sync condition table. This one right here is the one that extends the script include we were just on. So it has access to all those methods and functions. But then this is how we tailor this functionality for JIRA's specific use case. So you can see that I do define a sync action script here, and this is actually what's responsible for sending that information over to JIRA. And so one example of how JIRA is a little bit different than as opposed to what we'll see later for Slack is, again, going back to that mid-server issue, that can take a long time for it to complete. So we don't want users to sit there waiting for the API call and for us to receive that information back. So what I've done here is I've actually asynchronized the API call so that users don't have to sit through that. And I've done this through a schedule once, so you can just specify, hey, this is a script I want to run. And you can fire it asynchronously rather than in the user session. So the next is we'll be looking at the business rules, and I've went ahead and have that pulled up in ServiceNow. That is not the right place. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is the business rule that exists on the JIRA issues table. Again, this is our local storage of all the JIRA issues that we have synced to JIRA. You can see in the conditions, one of the things, sorry. Oh, that's not cool. There we go. That's better. Okay, so again, this is on the JIRA issues table. And you can see this is one of the ways that I'm preventing that infinite loop situation so that, hey, if it's that service account, we don't need to cascade those updates to the task. Just go ahead and bypass this. And then if we go into the script, it's a pretty simple call. I have a method dedicated to the cascading of the updates in the JIRA integration script include. So the next business rule is the rule that actually gets auto-created based on the creation of that condition for JIRA. And this is responsible for calling that sync command to go and update JIRA. So you can see that all I do is call the script include and tell it to perform the sync method. Again, that sync method exists on the base script include, and it's there to make sure that it is ready to do the sync, otherwise it'll abort. But then that global method will then call the sync action, which exists on the extended script include for Expedia Sync JIRA. All right, I think we're down to the last bit of the interactive demo here, and this is going over what I've done for Slack, just so you can see some of the minor differences between what I did for JIRA versus Slack. Yes? No, not currently. I think we'd probably need something over built for the JIRA, on the JIRA side, to basically tell ServiceNow that, hey, this is created and you should link it. That could be something that we ask JIRA folks to do. That said, we could also update our sync job to say, hey, does this task have anything that it's linked to? And then go ahead and automatically establish that link. That's a good idea. Yeah. We have a corporate domain service account that performs all these actions. So JIRA knows who that account is, and it lets it through. And that service account basically has API permissions to go in and look at the various projects so that you don't have to specify permissions specific to each project on that service account. So yeah, I believe it is using basic authentication. Yes. That's a good question. I haven't looked at the tables in prod in a while, so I don't know how many issues we have linked currently. I mean, just in our dev instance, we have like at least several hundred issues currently synced, but I don't know how that compares to prod since it's rather stale at this point.
You mentioned the webhooks weren't ready. Do you have an idea when those are going to be played? Is that something you just haven't done yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, we don't have access to develop on JIRA ourselves since we're dedicated to ServiceNow. But yeah, I don't have a timeline. But yeah, basically what their plan is to do is they'll have a webhook that looks for a particular label that will be applying to the JIRA issue itself. And then that way it knows which issues we actually want to send to ServiceNow. One of their concerns was they don't want to send us something for every single issue every time it's updated. Again, we wanted to save on bandwidth. And so the idea was that we're going to create that label on the records that we are currently synced to, and then the webhook will know, I'll only send it in for these issues. Here. That's our current functionality. We are right now extending that to allow some form of JIRA issue creation from ServiceNow. Again, we wanted to start simple because we did try to do that in our original integration to have this very multifaceted feature set. But we wanted to make sure that we had a good underlying architecture for this before we went anything too crazy. Basically, it's like that whole argument for doing your MVP first before you kind of do the full feature set. I'm sorry? That's a good question. I can head over to the JIRA issue table, and we can actually just open up one of those records. Assuming I can find my cursor. There we go. And I'll just open up this one. And let's look at the XML. So this is the JSON payload that we received for that JIRA issue. So it's nothing too crazy, but it gives us the full information about that JIRA issue. I'm sorry? Yeah, basically what I do is, because I store what I received last, and then I store what I just received. And that allows me to say, hey, for this field, because I care about it based on the relationship table that says I care about this field for this task, I can see, hey, what was it before? Okay, here's what it is now, and then I can post an update to that task saying, hey, this field went from this to this. Even with the comments, since you can update comments in JIRA, it'll handle that as well to say, hey, this comment has been updated, it's now this. No, I keep it stored as an object because that allows me to say, hey, look for this field rather than trolling through and looping through an array. Yep. All right, so I'll go back. Sorry? Right now we're just doing a daily sync. We wanted to do it more, but we're also really concerned about the bandwidth that we are doing, and so is the JIRA team. But once we have the webhook enabled, receiving the updates from JIRA will be near instantaneous. And then we also push updates on demand from ServiceNow. So there's no delay in pushing the updates to JIRA. There's only right now a delay on receiving them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's basically what our sync job is doing. Is what it does is it looks at all the JIRA issues we have, and then of those which are linked to active tasks. And if they are not currently synced by the webhook, which none of them are right now, it will go ahead and call JIRA to say, hey, give me the latest of that issue, and then I can see, hey, did anything change that I care about? And if it does, then go ahead and post that update to the task. I mean, for one issue, like you saw the JSON payload for what constitutes an issue. So it's not like, I'm sorry? Honestly, I haven't measured it. But I mean, the scripts seem to run it pretty quickly, so we haven't had any bandwidth concerns with the current implementation right now. I mean, once webhook is enabled, it'll be a little more efficient since we'll receive the updates as we need them, and I don't have to ping JIRA needlessly if there's been no update to that issue.
This webhook is something that JIRA will create especially for you? Or
Yes. Yeah, so we have a team that does development for JIRA on our side, and they need to enable that webhook for us. I don't think it's not going to be a global webhook available everywhere. Yep. Yes. Well, so our old JIRA integration was dead. It was not working, so that made it easy. I didn't have to worry about so much of a cutover. But yeah, we have kind of our own way of like a pipeline. So we just have a dev environment. We can push it to test, and basically we tell people like, hey, go and try everything, and of course we'll test it too. And then once it's good to go, we'll go ahead and push. Just with the way that mid servers work, we have to go and update the REST calls to make sure that it's using the correct mid server, since we have different mid servers for prod and sub prod. But yeah, it was a relatively seamless installation. Oh yeah, I do want to mention that we did go through the process afterward to go ahead and delete a lot of the stuff from the old integration. I didn't do that initially just in case there was some method out there lurking that something relied on it. But yeah, so that happened after we did the initial install. Yeah. Oh, sorry. You.
Do you have guidance for your developers and your sysadmins on what should be synced, what they should?
I mean, so these are the links are established by end users. So a fulfiller running an incident will just might decide that, hey, this needs to be linked to this JIRA, so they'll go ahead and establish that. So there's not really any rules other than we only allow linking from a task record. So if there's some other table that's not currently linked to task, you can't sync that. It's enabled for Slack. You can sync any table you want from Slack. Though we have restricted it to just a few choices, just to allow people to make it a little easier to use rather than seeing a huge list of hundreds of tables. Yeah.
Are you planning on releasing this on GitHub or share site?
That's a good question. I don't know. That would be great if I can. I'd have to talk to the powers that be over at my company before we can decide to do something like that. I mean, I will say right now it's not a scoped app. We built it in global, so that might make a bit of a difference as far as how easy it is to just drop it and install. Though that said, I can't think of anything that we've done in particular that means it wouldn't work on somebody else's instance. But yeah, that might be something that we might want to do at some point. I think I'd want to wait until it's a little more feature-rich because, honestly, it's a little basic at the moment because, I want to make sure the foundation is good first before I build a grand thing. Oh, yeah.
I noticed from JIRA into ServiceNow, it was internal worknotes, not visible to the end user. Which tool handles customer communication? You have linked the two together.
You mean just how do end users get updated based off?
Yeah, somebody is making the billing or responding to an incident in JIRA, but your end user is using ServiceNow to track their ticket.
Well,
Providing them with updates?
yeah, so I mean, we post to the comments field, so that's going to be available to anyone who has access to see that task. And a lot of times we have notifications set up in ServiceNow that will cascade that update to whomever it needs to go to. So they should be receiving those emails.
Tied to the JIRA task or tied to the ServiceNow?
The notifications, they're tied to the ServiceNow task, yeah.
I have a second question.
Sure.
Did you look into any third-party solutions, or what helped make your decision to do internal versus looking at third-party that had integration as their specialty?
That's a good question. So we had the JIRA integration set up already, that old one, and initially my task was to go and fix it. And when I looked at it, I'm like, oh my God, this is going to take me longer to fix than just to kind of scratch it. And I still use components that are useful from the old integration, so I already had some lift from that. But for the most part, I redesigned it from scratch. I guess, maybe we're a little bit of an anomaly, but we've been in ServiceNow for quite a while, so we have a pretty experienced dev team. And it's easier for us to support code that we've written that we know about than bring in something that's completely, we don't know what it is. And just, again, the fact that I had some components that were already useful for me, it just made it kind of a quick decision. Like, yeah, let's just go ahead and build a better version. All right, I guess I have just a couple minutes, maybe go back to my Notepad++. So the last thing I'll just show off real quick is the extended script include for Slack. You can see that the sync action is just a little bit different. Again, it's to cater to the specific needs of Slack. And one example of that is because I don't need to worry about a mid server for Slack, I can just go ahead and make the API call to Slack immediately. And that just makes it that much more responsive for users to receive the update in Slack. All right, so I guess that's about it. If anyone has any final questions. Yeah. Yeah, I believe so. I don't know if I need to update that or somebody else does. I'll ask that guy over there later. But yeah, one way or another, I'll make sure that it's there. All right, well, I guess, thank you. So again, just the top takeaways as a summary. Don't try and do everything. I found that starting simple with your MVP and make sure that's rock solid is good. Let's see, there you go. And then the second one is if you have a good idea that you can extend, you'll severely cut down your dev time for anything else that can use similar functionality. So yeah, don't reinvent the wheel every time. Build something reusable. For that, sync conditions is kind of my example. I was able to get the Slack integration up and running that much quicker since I already had a foundation to allow me to send those updates. We're even extending that even now and coming up with new ideas for how we want to use that table. And finally, again, yeah, sometimes you just got to burn it down, start fresh. You can take all of your lessons learned and make sure that you build a better version for the next time around. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.